For swinish gluttony ne'er looks to heaven amidst his gorgeous feast, but with spotted base ingratitude, crams and blasphemes his feeder. Shall I go on, or have I said enough? So you cue the parents in the audience kind of, laughing because they're so proud of their daughter here. It's a pretty amazing argument she's making here, isn't it? It's 1634. I mean, Antonella, you said before that it's a poem very much against the excesses of court. And we can only imagine the kind of discomfort, maybe, that the Earl of Bridgewater might have felt while this is happening. On the one hand, he's being reassured about good men. And the Earl of Bridgewater is nodding to himself internally, saying, yes, I am one of those good men. On the other hand, there may be a sense in which the Earl of Bridgewater might know that this is this young Puritan poet that might be attacking him. And it's again going back to what I was saying about Virgil, where a poet is operating on more than one level. And on the one hand is satisfying his patron, but on the other hand, for close readers like us may actually see more here. And this is not only then a critique of aristocratic rituals, but it's a critique of the whole economic structure of the aristocracy. I mean, it's pretty democratic for that time. I mean, that's an anachronism even to speak about democracy, but there is this sense of people, of the protest towards those people are hoarding. Again, on line 768, if every just man that now pines with want had but a moderate and beseeming share of that which lewdly pampered luxury now heaps upon some few with vast excess. Who owns like 95% of the wealth in America, or 50% of the wealth in America? Like the top 1% or something? Probably true in Israel also, right? Now heaps upon some few with vast excess, nature's full blessings would be well dispensed in unsuperfluous even proportion. Meaning we just distributed things equally, nature would not be heaped up with vast excess, and she no whit encumbered with her store, and then the giver, God, would be better thanked. His praise due paid, for swinish gluttony ne'er looks to heaven amidst his gorgeous feast, but with besotted base ingratitude crams and blasphemes his feeder. So it's not only a protest against the aesthetics of the mask, the conspicuous consumption of the mask. Not only that, but also the economic structures that support it. Should we let her go on? Let's see what else she has to say. Shall I go on, or have I said enough? To him that dares arm his profane tongue with contemptuous words against the sun-clad power of chastity. Fain would I say something, yet to what end? How can I even talk to you? You are speaking against the sun-clad power of chastity. Sun-clad? Sun-clad?
As opposed to Camus.
Pardon? As opposed to?
Camus. Who associates himself with night.
Ah, good. Okay, good. Against the sun-clad. So there's a lot here. Sun-clad is in the daytime. It's also this sense of chastity, which is associated not only, as we saw, as Milton keeps on insisting, with the self, but also something beyond it, the sun. And of course, once I say that, then I can say against the sun-clad power of chastity. It's not just the sun as S-U-N, illuminating power of the universe, but the sun, S-O-N, the sun power, the sun-clad power of chastity. Again, where Milton is trying to balance those two things, one off the other. One, this idea of the power of the divine, and the other, that individuated power of personal freedom and chastity. Fain would I say something, yet to what end? How can I even talk to you? Thou hast nor ear nor soul to apprehend this sublime notion and high mystery that must be uttered to unfold the sage and serious doctrine of virginity. And thou art worthy that thou shouldst not know more happiness than this thy present lot. Enjoy your dear wit. I mean, I'm not going to even tell you. Enjoy your dear wit and gay rhetoric that hast so well been taught her dazzling fence. Thou art not fit to hear thyself convinced. Yet should I try, the uncontrolled worth of this pure cause would kindle my rapt spirits to such a flame of sacred vehemence that dumb things would be moved to sympathize, and the brute earth would lend her nerves and shake, till all thy magic structures reared so high were shattered into heaps o'er thy false head. Can just to our final burst of energy today. How do you read these last lines? 490 to 800.
You're not even worth arguing with.
Okay, meaning, if you remember the Confessions, when Augustine writes, Augustine was a rhetoric teacher, and he's constantly distinguishing his new life from that life of his earlier life as a rhetoric teacher. A lot of the Confessions is about the use that words can be put to, and he decides when he becomes a follower of Jesus that he's not going to use rhetoric to deceive people, but not words to deceive people, but words to bring people good news. That's what an evangelical is, somebody who brings good news. So here also the lady is saying in that tradition, I'm not going to even talk in your presence. You can have your dear wit and gay rhetoric. And here, I think the comparison with Augustine is not inauspicious, that I'm going to use language the way it's supposed to be used. We had an image of poetry used in the wrong way, and I just used it in the way it's supposed to be used. And I'll even let you know that there's another kind of language, which I won't even say in front of you, because if I did, it would have effects not only on you, but the world. Let's read those lines again. Yet should I try, so Shuki says, I'm not trying. Yet should I try the uncontrolled worth of this, the uncontrolled, I guess, unbound, worth of this pure cause would kindle my rapt spirits to such a flame of sacred vehemence. Here it seems like she's talking not only with her spirit, but with her body, to such a flame of sacred vehemence. I guess sacred vehemence would be a bad way to describe a lot of religious rhetoric in Israel today. People who talk with the vehemence of the sacred, but here it's not negative, it's positive. This pure cause would kindle my rapt spirits to such a flame of sacred vehemence that dumb things would be moved to sympathize, and the brute earth would lend her nerves and shake, till all thy magic structures reared so high were shattered into heaps o'er thy false head. What could her language do if she wanted it to?
Destroy his?
I mean, in a way, so this is another, maybe, in L'Allegro nel Penseroso, we're left with that kind of fraught opposition between mirth and melancholy. Here, her language of chastity has the power to completely destroy his magic structures. And Comus's acknowledgement in the next line, she fables not. I feel that I do fear her words set off by some superior power. That's kind of like Comus's acknowledgement that her language, which she doesn't even speak, but only threatens to speak, has powers that he cannot even imagine. His language is a language of a certain kind of art, a certain kind of aesthetics associated with deception. And even Comus understands that she fables not, meaning her language is not associated with deception and falsehood and fable, but with a certain kind of truth. So though Milton at the end of Il Penseroso says or writes that he might attain something like prophetic strain, here the lady in Comus is already herself moving towards that or anticipating that, a kind of chaste poetry, which in a sense doesn't make any sense whatsoever. How can you write a chaste poetry? Milton's poetry by definition seems to always be expressive And we feel, even as Milton is representing Comus, we feel the fecundity of the world that he represents. The poem is a poem, even though the aesthetic and the economics are rejected. The poem nonetheless is a poem of images, of beauty. Though Milton in the figure of the lady, and I don't know if I told you this, but when he was in college at Cambridge, he was called the Lady of Christ. He was the Lady of Christ Church. That's where he studied. So for some reason, was he effeminate? Was he youthful? He was called the Lady of Christ Church.
I read somewhere that it's because he was he never saw the sun, so he was very fair, very pale.
That makes sense.
That's what they call him.
So, but Milton may identify here with the lady and the kind of poetry that she aspires to sing. So I said at the beginning, or that maybe in some ways you can understand this poem as a kind of pastoral competition, meaning there are different voices competing with one another. And this is really what Chani said. It's just like L'Allegro nel Pensieroso was a kind of pastoral competition. But this is different in importing two things. I think there are two things that make this poem important just to see in the evolution of Milton. One is the way that this idea of chastity informs a conception of individual agency, and already Milton, and strong agency. And already Milton worried about, well, if I believe in strong agency, well, what about the role of heaven? How do those two things interact? How can we have how can you have free will and at the same time God's knowledge? So on the one hand, we see this development of the individual, and the improvement, or not the improvement, or the development from Hamlet is the way in which the self-consciousness that Hamlet evokes or represents is now reinforced with this very strong Christian language, this very explicit Christian language. And the other part then is really what we started with today, is just another exercise in Miltonic appropriation. The way in which Milton takes things from other contexts, other cultures, Greece, Rome, the Old Testament, and kind of sucks them into himself. Milton might have very easily turned down this commission by the Earl of Bridgewater. So we could say, yes, he wanted the money. We could say, yes, he wanted the platform. But we could also say that he used that platform by appropriating the genre to himself. He really takes the genre. It's really Miltonic chutzpah in its extreme. He takes a genre that's devoted to extravagance, to luxury, to the aristocracy, and he puts it in the service of an icon of a kind of democratic economic ethos where people share, where things are equally distributed. I mean, you really would wonder how the Earl of Bridgewater, how he goes to sleep that night. Because on the one hand, as we said, he's one of the good men who is partaking, as I'm sure, I mean, what do you imagine? You ever go to a dessert table at like a hotel? If you've ever been to a dessert table at a religious hotel, I'm sorry to make religious categories here, but a dessert table at a religious hotel, it's like I don't know, what would be the right metaphor, Shani? It seems like you might have been there to one of them as well. It's like now you see it now. Well, go ahead, Shani.
Nothing. I don't have like a metaphor, but I see the image in my head.
It's now you see it, now you don't, right? It's like everybody's ready, on your mark, get set, go, right? So you're wondering, like, what was the buffet table like at this feast, at the Mass? On the one hand, people see all the delicacies there and they really want to chow down. On the other hand, maybe having remembered parts of the poem or internalized parts of the poem, they act with a little bit more sobriety, a little bit more soberness. In Johnson's poem, pleasure and, virtue and pleasure get to be reconciled. You can be a good virtuous person and you could party down. In a way, Milton is doing a similar thing, but his idea of virtue is very, very different. And his idea of pleasure is very different. His idea of virtue is not only classical, but Christian. And his idea of pleasure is not the uncontrolled. Do you ever see pictures of Trump's apartment on 57th Street in Trump Tower? Well, you can Google it. It's just like this, it's like this gaudy extravagance of stated overconsumption. So Milton seems to be saying, again, he's not arguing, his chastity is not virginity. His chastity involves some partaking, but it's a sober partaking. And that soberness, that sober chastity is not just an external, it's not only an external function, it's an active intellectual function. It's controlling appetite with will. It's choice. Milton very much, Hobbes is the great writer in the English tradition of power. Milton is the great poet of choice, the great poet of liberty. Everything from everywhere in Milton's work, from here on in, I think, is the centrality of choosing, of choice. It's interesting that Milton chooses the feminine and chastity as a means of expressing this. Just, I mean, in a way, it's the occasion, right? He's writing for the daughter and he's writing for the two brothers. But he does, and maybe that's how he begins to formulate this idea of chastity as a virtue, by associating it with the daughter of the Earl of Bridgewater, and from that taking this occasion. Again, Milton, and this is what poets do, right? They take occasions, they run with them. He takes the occasion and he uses it to express not only his particular take on the mask, kind of just turning the mask upside down and placing in the center of it, not a conspicuous consumption, but virtue, chastity, freedom, agency, and also a poetic that may go along with that. The lady doesn't articulate it at the end. She says, I could say it. You might think of the rest of Milton's career as actually starting to say it. Remember at the beginning of the poem, he says he's looking for some people have to, yet some there be that by due steps aspire to lay their hands on that golden key that opes the palace of eternity. That's Milton. He's aspiring to find a way of opening the palace of eternity. How can I express in language things that are beyond language? How can I express in a physical medium things that go beyond a physical medium? And that's and that question goes back to our original questions, or some of the questions that we started out with, which is questions of representation. How do I take something which is abstract, in this case spiritual, maybe even divine, and represent it without becoming an idolater, right? And the second part of that, that's what we see in the lady, is once we have that representation, how do I learn to read properly? How do I learn not to read? How do I learn not to get seduced by the image and to see something else, if there is something else? Meaning, if Milton can fulfill his side of the bargain, what does the reader have to do? So the ladies in Comus is very much part of this beginning to think seriously, not only about aesthetics that he does in L'Allegro and Il Penseroso, and Il Penseroso also, as Shani pointed out, it's directions on how to read properly, right? But here we're finding out more about that subject, the reading subject. And we're finding out more about different kinds of, or maybe like Shani says, this is a version of L'Allegro, but inflected from the point of view of Il Penseroso. Meaning L'Allegro represents herself in one way, Il Penseroso represents L'Allegro in a different way. And they kind of come together in Comus, which makes Comus a deceptive character, right? He uses rhetoric because on the one hand, he tries to fool us with L'Allegro, when we really see him as the version of mirth that Il Penseroso actually defined, a dangerous kind of mirth, a Dionysian kind of mirth, right? So we do have those things, that development of the aesthetic in L'Allegro and Il Penseroso, but in Comus, we do have this much more articulated sense of the Christian subject. I say Christian just because, and not just virtuous, because Milton is obviously writing in that context, a Christian context, but also just to bring in the possibility of free agency, at the same time accommodating God, heaven, providence, which will be a continued problem. Like how can you believe in free will if you believe in God? It seems like in the contemporary Israeli scene, if you read the newspapers, that people who believe in God abdicate their free will altogether, which gives people the impression that somehow to believe in God means to abdicate your free will. Milton is developing a theology through his poetry in which free will goes with the belief in God. And almost also the way in which, we said this last time, the way in which skepticism and belief can come together. So the oppositions that have broken down for us in our culture, for many, many different reasons over hundreds of years, the oppositions that have broken down such that we now see free will as separate and we see belief in God as separate. And not only that, but whole sociologies or whole sociological groups depend upon these distinctions, such that we think of one group who embrace free will and reject God. They are the true representatives of freedom. And those who embrace God and reject through their practice free will seem to represent what it means to be a pious person. In a way, our culture gives us very, very scant choices. We're faced with either ors, which in Milton's poem, he's really breaking down. And we're faced with that either or of you either, a true believer and, are coughing at policemen in B'nai Brak, or you're a secular person who votes for merits and does a million different things, right? So you have this kind of, I know I'm speaking in very, very schematic terms, and there are ways of breaking down this distinction, but we do tend to think in those terms. And Milton as a poet, I think here, is trying to break through, even with the mask, as constraining a generic straitjacket as it is. He's using the mask as a way to begin to express the possibility of not only a new kind of poetry, which he starts doing in Il Penseroso, but a new kind of selfhood. Do those contemporary references, does it help articulate or make a little bit more sense of things?
Yeah.
Right.
Doesn't free will always have to, like, if religion always talks about punishment and reward, there would be no meaning to punishment and reward if we don't have free will. The only way that has any meaning is if we have free will.
Excellent. So that's one part of the argument. That's why, and in book 3 of Paradise Lost, Milton makes exactly that argument. God says that. I mean, if I didn't give you free will, then what would be the point of your obedience or keeping my commands? But the other side of it is free will, on the most basic kind of, schematic way of thinking about it, if I can choose freely, that does seem to imply that the outcome is not known. And if the outcome is not known, that would compromise God being all-knowing. Meaning it's very hard to maintain, and different theologians will do it in different ways or try to, a belief in an all-powerful, all-knowing God who knows the history of mankind from beginning to end, and simultaneously to maintain that idea of free will, which, as you're saying, also underlies the conception of reward and punishment. So how do you get to have both of those things?
Didn't Rambam discuss this also? Like, he was a real believer in free will, right? Rambam says you have the choice.
Okay, so I'm sure he does. And Rambam will probably be as complicated as Milton in trying to figure out what he's saying. Because the argument is, it's I don't want to say it's a philosophically impossible argument to make, but in like pure formalistic philosophical terms, I think it is. Hobbes and a contemporary of his, a theologian, I think it was Bishop Rommel, they had this very, 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 very lengthy correspondence, hundreds and hundreds of pages, contending about just this issue. And they were both bright guys, right? So, and meaning they're both articulating sides of the argument. And from a certain perspective, certain arguments about free will do make certain arguments about providence impossible, and vice versa. And in a way, and I think this is why poetry is better than philosophy, is that Milton will solve this issue, again, by not solving it, but by representing it poetically. Once you start to use a philosophical language, a language that demands either A or B, you believe in free will or you believe in providence, and they do seem to really be incommensurable. Once you get there, you're in a kind of trap. But when you're in the realm of the poetic, you can deal with paradox and not contradiction. And paradox allows for, so a philosopher would say, oh, well, there you're just being literary critics now. And if you're more rigorous, you would understand that there are certain things that are just contradictions that can't be resolved. But if you're a poet, you can approach things and say, paradox is actually a way of knowing. It's not just incoherence. It's a better way of knowing. So when you see the line, like we saw it even at the very beginning of the poem, where I said Milton is worrying about the relationship between free will and determinism, or free will and providence. I'm using the philosophical term, sorry.
Well, what did you mean by saying the paradoxes are ways of knowing?
I don't know necessarily what I mean here. That's a hard, I don't know. Somebody would want to help me? I think I can know at some point, but I don't think I know now. Would anybody want to maybe help me make sense of what I said? I think it does make sense, meaning, and I'm hoping you'll help me now at this late hour. Just tell me what it might mean.
You also said that,
yeah.
the poetic realm domain allows for not contradiction, paradox, and not allows for contradiction to tension to coexist, right?
Right.
You don't need to resolve it.
Right, which is why I said about l'allegro and il penseroso that they are both true in some level, and Milton is choosing both of them. Probably choosing both of them as representing different kinds of poetry at different stages of one's life. And why I told you the Haydn libretto, which is not only l'allegro and il penseroso, but il moderato, is a misreading of Milton because it denies the extremes. And Milton never denies the extremes. He always maintains the extremes. So that in a way is, for a philosopher, counterintuitive.
Don't we have this argument in modern times, not on theological terms, but more on sociological and psychological terms, in that, like you discuss whether a person had the choice to be a criminal, or whether he was brought up that way, or whether Freud say it was predetermined or whatever. So that we have that kind of argument, and that's a lot of liberal versus conservative kind of way of looking at the world, right?
He killed 13 people, but he had a bad childhood. Well, that's Freudian determinism, basically, right?
Right.
Meaning he didn't have his agency. There's no agency, and there are different extremes of the argument, right? That's not necessarily Freud. It's a vulgar version of Freud, right?
Right.
There is. I'm glad. I often tell Tikva not to bring in things from other traditions, but just in the rabbinic tradition, there is this idea that two contradictory perspectives can both be true. That is, it's these and these are the words of the living God. The two different people or groups of people argue with one another. They're diametrically opposed. Can I do this or can't do this? One says permitted, one says forbidden, and those are incommensurable philosophically, right? You can't say both. And the rabbinic perspective, one has to work out what they're saying is these and these are the words of the living God, that somehow they're both true. But I think that they also want to maintain the dialectic. They don't want to collapse the dialectic. And in Milton also, there's a desire to keep the oppositions in place and to maintain them as much as possible. So there are different versions of this reason of free will and providence. But it's something that Milton really, really worries about a lot in Paradise Lost, and he's also doing this in l'allegro and il penseroso. And I think what's interesting about Milton is that he gives us a language, or he gives us a vocabulary to think about these things for ourselves. Meaning we don't have to be Christians and we don't have to believe in chastity to think about these things with Milton, but to think ourselves about, like, well, you know, when politicians or theologians who act like politicians or politicians who act like theologians talk about what it is to be religious, and they emphasize, you know, obedience, or, you know, lack of, or the virtue of always listening and obeying, right? That's a very particular version of theology, a very particular version of religion. And Milton is trying to, we will pay attention to his context as well, to maintain some kind of balance in which you can maintain both of these things at once. So I think that's also present there. And we'll see that continuing to be present in Milton's later works. Ben, you want to say something?
In Paradise Lost, in the beginning, don't if they make love before they eat from the apple, right? And that's considered chaste lovemaking?
Yeah, kind of. I mean, he talks about it, yeah. There's a before and after, right? They make love before the fall and after the fall. Big difference.
So that would be like an extension of this concept of chaste, that you can be chaste, yeah, but not
exactly. Exactly.
Okay.
See, did you have any questions?
I'm overwhelmed with questions. I'm really perplexed. I have to say, you went really fast for me, because English is not my first language too. So also it was, and also the,
you know that very. I don't want to embarrass you, C, but do you know that C won the Rector's Prize for being like one of the best students in the entire, you know, college? You know why he won the Rector's Prize? Because he asked questions like this. But stop acting. But that's why. But don't, your confusion is a meaningful one. So why don't you ask a question?
I don't know. But just, you said that his rhetoric, aesthetics, what the Comus rhetoric is of deception and subterfuge. And like the lady is kind of an antidote, because she has the. So what exactly is the lady? She's chastity, but what kind of, like that's what I'm trying to. What is it about?
I don't know. I mean, it also, we didn't really take into account the idea that she can't get up by herself, right? She needs an external influence to help her up. So even though she's like very strong in a certain level, there is a kind of implicit, there's this need for guidance. I'm not sure what all of this means. I'm not sure. I mean, I think that those last lines, Milton is intimating, suggesting that there is an aesthetic that can do more. They can do something different than the language of Comus.
Well, what kind of aesthetic? Well, what is the right aesthetic that he propounds?
The one that helps him write Paradise Lost.
All right.
Right? Coming attractions, we don't know yet. It's really, the whole question is, how can you be a Puritan poet? Doesn't make sense. But again, there's always that impulse that Milton feels, and we see in the beginning of this poem. You need the golden key. Somebody's got to do it. And that's the chutzpah of Milton. It's simultaneously the chutzpah, but it's also, Milton is fully embracing his individual agency. I'm responsible. I must do this. I think that's why he's a very inspiring poet, if you're allowed to say such things like that. You weren't allowed to say such things like that before the coronavirus, but now you are, because people realize again that literature actually means something, and it actually can inspire you, and you don't have to make believe that it doesn't, and talk about theories and use advanced literary critical language. I mean, I'm all for those things, but also to remember that poetry does move us, and for a good reason. Yala? Okay, go ahead, Yala. I'm listening, Alana. Go ahead, yeah.
Another thing that came across here, a theme that was in the poem that we read today, was this theme of praising and critiquing at the same time. And I think that there's an array of artists and poets who do that. And that's, because and particularly in regimes where there isn't free speech, so you find that a lot. But one of the associations that came to mind was the artist Goya, who painted the royal family, and he was their portraitist, but if you look at it, he's also satirizing the royal family at the same time.
Right. I mean, there's an article, I was just signaling to my kids. There's an article by Leo, there's an argument by Leo Strauss, who's a classicist, and I may have mentioned it to some of you, called Persecution and the Art of Writing. Strauss himself is a very influential classicist. And the argument of persecution and the art of writing is that people can never always say everything that they want to say. Because Virgil doesn't want to get killed by Augustus, but he does run and write poetry. Your mentioning of Goya. Milton here with the Earl of Bridgewater. He does want the occasion, and he takes the occasion, and he writes in a way that maybe the patrons who can't wait for the buffet don't hear it, but we do hear it.
Maybe that kind of restriction on the poet and making him think, it enriches their poetry by giving it many different levels.
You know, I think if any of you have ever written for a newspaper or a journal, that there's versions of that always maintain. You can't always write what you want. If you're a creative nonfiction writer, you can't always write what you want, right? There's some limitations in what you can say. The different genres, and obviously there are distinctions. If you live in North Korea, or you know, if you live under Augustus, the restrictions about what you can write are far greater than if you're writing for, you know, an editorial for, you know, whatever, for Haaretz. But they are always in place. And I think you're right. Those restrictions and occasions can be very useful and enabling. And I would recommend also when you're writing papers, especially if you're a graduate student, to think of your papers as occasions, meaning don't get bogged down by thinking, you know, I'm writing something now for eternity. I'm writing something right now because I have this task to do right now, and I'm taking the opportunity to grab the genre, the MA thesis, the creative writing project, to grab this genre and to make the best of it. But understanding your writing tasks as occasions, it frees you. You don't have to start thinking, you know, I'm writing for posterity. There were, in the 18th century, people wrote lots of poems, you know, on the occasion of this. I mean, this is an occasional poem, on the occasion of this building of this house, on the occasion of this guy becoming prince, right? The poets, the day came, they had to produce the poem. And in many cases, as Ilana was saying, it really is enabling. So that's just a process-oriented thing that I think we can learn from people who write within genres and who write for occasions, that they provide opportunities. And the very limitation that time or temporality imposes on it is the very thing that actually makes it possible to do big things. Does that make sense, See?
Yeah, I mean, you have to have it in you, the ability to make those, you know, I mean, it brings it out of you. It's like the imposition, the external.
So that's exactly kind of what Milton's idea is in relationship to, you know, the lady in heaven. That her knowledge of heaven brings out her chastity, it brings out her individuality. Okay, this is really fun.
So what you're saying, Professor, that the fact that God imposes on us His omniscience, or I don't know, like His all-knowing presence, actually doesn't contradict the fact that we have our innate, like inherent genius. Or I don't know.
I think this is me, not Milton, but I think you could say that God gives us this moment, this current moment, has presented history to us in such a way that we have the ability to relate to it, react to it, and actually address it, engage it, appropriate it. That's what free will is, and that's what the divine is. The divine is saying, here it is. Here's the coronavirus. Deal with it, right? Deal with it. And you can see now that we're faced with life and death situations, right? That some people are not dealing with it, right? And there are huge consequences to that, right? The idea that you're being addressed And in a way, you see that there are certain religious sensibilities that do not want to be addressed by reality. And that's a highly I'll say it, it's a not Jewish way of living. Reality is there to address you. You don't live in a bubble. And the reason that certain people are so bad at making decisions, and this is pure me now, and you can make a parallel between Trump and the religious leadership in the Haredi community, is because they've never related to reality. None of them. Trump had never lived in reality. He lived in a reality created by his father and his money. He never had to face consequences. He never had to do anything. And that's the same thing with the yeshiva world, especially the leaders. They're completely insulated. They might be great people. I know many of them. They are good people, but they have no ability to make practical decisions because they have no practice with it. So I think going back to just general discussions that emerge from Milton is that, yes, you can look at God's providential narrative, and now I'm speaking in terms that I'll talk about when I talk about in Paradise Lost. Well, let's make it just completely relevant to Paradise Lost. In Paradise Lost, God is the author of all things, and Adam and Eve are described as authors of themselves. That's right there, the paradox that poetry allows and philosophy doesn't. So philosophers look at it and say, which is it? Are they authors to themselves, or is God the author of all things? And Milton will say both. And I think a preliminary reading of this is that God authors all things. He is the arch narrator, the one who writes everything. And in Paradise Lost, he's always using these metaphors of literary writing, God as writer, or people telling their own stories, or God telling a story, or Satan telling a story. So God is the ultimate author of all things. But within that narrative, there are ways of Adam and Eve gaining authorship for themselves. And that gaining of authorship, I think, comes through the way they interpret the world. That's their free choice. Free choice is interpretation. I think we said that for Spencer also. Who was in my class last semester? Nobody. Shani, you were in my class last semester. We really talked about Protestantism or Puritanism. It's basically, it boils down to a way of reading, a certain kind of way of reading the world. And that reading implies an engagement as well. I am making myself present to the world. So we can continue these conversations. I'm glad we hung on, and thank you very, very much for coming. You're all heroes for being here, as I say all the time. Have a good Pesach. I will be in touch next week. If I'm trying to remind myself to be online in our, in my 24/6 office hours. But if you